king, and then the parliament does something that is really pretty crazy. It was crazy enough to kill the king, but now you're essentially killing monarchy. What they said was, you know what? Forget the king, forget the monarchy. We're going to do this without a monarchy, and it's going to be so much better because we're going to have, the guy who was in charge of the army, Oliver Cromwell. He's pretty puritanical. So he's going to be the guy in charge. He's got to control the military, so we're going to have law and order. But at the same time, he is on board with Puritan ideas. This is great. And for about 11 years, you have this Commonwealth. There is no monarchy, which is a completely rare thing in Europe at this point. I mean, the Netherlands tries to pull this off, but even they kind of are it's a little messy there. For the most part, this is just a weird thing. And you can understand the rest of the monarchs around Europe going, I don't like the idea of this. That if everybody starts to think they can do without monarchs, I'm not going to last very much longer. Well, this doesn't work out very well. They kind of hold it together for about 10 years there, but when Oliver Cromwell dies, there's nobody who can really sort of step in and do anything. And the parliament kind of decides, you know what, this is turning into a little bit of a mess. It wasn't the Commonwealth was a great idea, but we couldn't pull it off. We got to sort of return. So what happens is this thing called the Restoration, where they're going to restore the Stuart monarchy, where they say to the Stuarts, at this point, the person who comes in is Charles II. They say to Charles II, I don't remember, I think he was Charles I's son who was in exile in France. He says, look, you can come back, but you got to chill out a little bit, all right? Your dad was a little over the top. Your grandpa was a little over the top. You need to chill out. We're going to let you be the king again. We're going to make the monarchy, restore the monarchy. So he works with Parliament, but there's very little trust. I mean, Parliament's always going, what, did you just do something there? Hold on. And the king's going, whoa, hey, I'm the king still. Like, if you don't let me be king, then what's the point of having a king? And so it's kind of messy. And eventually, you end up with James II in control. And James II, he said, you know what, I'm the king. I'm going to bring Catholicism back to England. You can imagine what this Puritan, the Calvinist Parliament thought about this. They said, that is not cool. And what they basically sit down, they say, look, all right, we can't go without a king. That's crazy. That just isn't working very well. So we got to have a monarchy. But we can't have this monarchy. We can't have James II. And we have to have a monarchy that, whenever you get a new monarchy in, they can't just say, I'm going to go Catholic and I'm going to take y'all with me and then drag y'all to hell. We can't have that anymore. So we got to figure out a way to have a monarchy, but also make sure there are some limits on what the king can do. So they decide they want a new king, and they look around, they find somebody who's probably the best bet. James II's daughter is named Mary. And Mary had been married off to, and I mean that in the verb like that, married off to, William of Orange, who was the stadtholder of the Dutch, which isn't exactly king, but it kind of is like a pretend. It's almost the same as a king in. The Dutch were in the Netherlands, they said, we're not going to have a king. We're going to have a thing called stadtholder, which is just basically the same thing as a king. So the parliament turns to James's daughter Mary. She's married to William of Orange, who's the stadtholder of the Dutch. And they say, look, William and Mary, we're going to have you guys come in to be the king. You're Protestant. He's Protestant. She's Protestant by marriage. Whoops. Not she. She's Protestant by marriage. The English aren't big fans of the Dutch, but the Parliament, the Puritans would rather have, a Protestant in charge than a Catholic in charge. So 1688, you have this thing called the Glorious Revolution. It's essentially a bloodless revolution. Now, mostly because there wasn't really a war. There wasn't really a revolution. William and Mary, the Parliament invited them over. William and Mary got in a boat, came over, and James II fled because all of his support left him. And essentially they just walked into London and they were crowned king and queen together. They arrive, they take over, they're crowned together. That's one of the few monarchies where you say they're both the king and queen at the same time. It's not just there's a king with their consort or a queen with their consort. It's the king and queen. They're both equally king and queen. Because she's still a Stuart. She's kind of messed up, and she's a woman. Ugh. It's freaky. He, first of all, is a man, so you guys got that going for him, but he's also a Protestant, and so essentially tie those two together. She has legitimacy, he has sort of the ability to rule, so it's all going to work out. But now here's what they do. The Parliament says, look, we're going to have you come over, but we're going to put some stipulations, and we're going to actually write them down this time. We did this in the Restoration. We didn't write it down, and that was our problem, so we're going to write it down. It's called the Bill of Rights, 1689. And this Bill of Rights creates some things that are going to make a lot of sense to us in the modern age, but at the time, they were new things. Putting these limitations on the king and queen was kind of a weird thing. No taxation without the Parliament's consent. Now that's technically the way it always was, but now it's the king and queen essentially agreeing to this. We're not going to tax the people unless the Parliament gives their consent. Fine. No standing army without the Parliament's consent, because most of what taxation went for was to pay for the military. And once you have this army over here that is working for the king, well, now they can just march into Parliament and close them down. So essentially, you can't have a standing army without Parliament's consent, which means the standing army should be loyal to not the king and not the Parliament, but to the country itself. Free elections of Parliament. The king shouldn't be the one deciding who sits in the Parliament. It should be the people. And when I say the people, obviously I don't mean all the people, because we're still early on. We don't mean the women. We don't mean minorities. We don't mean people who are poor. We mean the people who are the sort of the rich, wealthy men. And then freedom of speech in Parliament. There should be sort of freedom. You should be able to say whatever you want in Parliament. Now, here's the thing. None of these things seem that crazy from our point of view, but these are new things, and these are sort of the seeds of what are going to eventually grow into American democracy and that system. But remember, a lot of the people that come up with the Constitution in America are really coming out of a British sort of society in which these are the dominant ideas, and so it's not crazy that this is sort of the starting point for America as well. So before we take a little break here, constitutionalism, it means a couple things. One, government should be limited in its powers by law. It's something we call today rule of law. In other words, it's not ruled by the king, but even the king is ruled by law. And the law is something that has come up with by the Parliament and monarch working together. So government should be limited in its powers by law. Parliament can't do whatever it wants. It's required to obey the law. Now, it can change the law along with the king, but there's a conversation that goes on there. It's not just that the king can change the law whenever they want to. That's going to be absolutism, where the government doesn't have to be limited by its powers by law. This is rule of law. The second idea is government authority depends on enforcing these limits. If the government's not enforcing these limits, then it's not the government. And so you can rebel, have a revolution, whatever you want, because the government's not obeying by its side of the contract. Now, what we're going to talk about next here is something called social contract theory. And don't write this down yet. I'm just setting you up for what we're going to. Social contract theory. A constitution is like a contract. If you ever read the Constitution, it's essentially a contract that's made that says, here's what we're going to do, here's what you're going to do. Everybody sign your name, and there's this contract that we have with each other, social contract. That's what constitutionalism essentially is this sort of contract. This is the idea that comes out of it. Now we're going to look at two ways this develops, and it's still talked about today. We're going to look at Thomas Hobbes, and we're going to look at John Locke. And we're going to compare their ideas. You're going to think, oh, John Locke is clearly the winner. He's not clearly the winner. Yes, he has the most influence in terms of the American Constitution and even many European constitutions today. In fact, constitutions all over the world, to be honest with you, because so many constitutions have copied the U.S. and others like that. But the Thomas Hobbes ideas are still out there and still dominant in a number of areas. So we're just going to talk about these things, and we're going to go from there. So start with Thomas Hobbes, and then we will work our way to John Locke. So Thomas Hobbes.